Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Secret of the Old Clock by Carolyn Keene, although not really. Published in 1930 originally, and this edition published in 1991 by Applewood Books. But there's another version that was published in 1959 by Groston and Dunlap. I'll explain all that shortly. This book is 210 pages. The Secret of the Old Clock is the very first installment in the very popular Nancy Drew mystery series for kids. The book series was created by a man named Edward Strameyer, who was one of the great driving forces in kids' literature in the early 20th century. He was the guy who came up with the idea of creating adventure book series for children. He created the characters of Tom Swift, the Bobbsey twins, the Hardy Boys, and Nancy Drew. The great success of the Hardy Boys, which I believe dates from like 1927 or so, the great success of the Hardy Boys led him to create a similar mystery series with a female detective, Nancy Drew. In the early versions of the Nancy Drew books, Nancy is a 16-year-old with blonde hair and blue eyes. She lives with her father, Carson Drew, who's a lawyer, in the fictional Midwestern town of River Heights. Her mother had died several years before. There's also a housekeeper who takes care of things. But Nancy's sort of the de facto housekeeper, along with the real housekeeper. And in addition to going to school and doing sports and everything else, she solves mysteries. Sometimes she stumbles onto mysteries, and sometimes her father has a case that she helps him out with. The history of the Nancy Drew books is rather complex, and so I'll only go into that just briefly, not get into the weeds too much. What Strameyer would do was he would write and he did this for all his books, he would write an outline of the plot, basically the characters and what's going to happen. Then he would hand it off to a staff of ghostwriters. And all of his books were published under different pseudonyms. For example, the Hardy Boys was published under the author Franklin W. Dixon, although it was actually a whole staff of people writing these things. And in this case, it was Carolyn Keene, another pseudonym. The 23 of the early books, including this one, were written by a woman named Mildred Bunsen, who was a staff writer for the Strameyer Syndicate. So she wrote this book and a bunch of others under the name Carolyn Keene. Now, what happened is, in 1959, Groston and Dunlap, the publishers of the Nancy Drew books and the Hardy Boys books, began very subtly rewriting these early books for several reasons. For one thing, as we'll see in a little bit, these early books often have racially stereotyped characters. And by the late 50s, early 60s, that was becoming increasingly problematic. So they would rewrite, getting rid of the stereotypical dialects and characters. Also, they made Nancy 2 years older, because in these early books, she's 16 years old, but she's driving around in a sports car. She has a blue roadster that she takes all over town and out in the country and so forth. So they make her a little bit older. And also, they kind of downplay some of they make her a more conventional character. She's not quite as aggressive, headstrong. As you can see in the illustration here, she's dressed like a flapper, because this is 1930, and she was very independent and went off on her own without consulting her father and things like that. So they kind of downplayed that. And they also got rid of the gunplay. There's a scene in here where the bad guys shoot at the cops, and so that was redone. But one of the more significant differences is they also shortened the books. This book is 210 pages. The revised version that came out in 1959 is 18 pages shorter. Now, the reason they did that is there's two reasons. One, they wanted to save on printing costs by making the book shorter, and they also wanted to speed up the action. These early books, they take a little while for something to go. It takes several chapters in here before we even get to the mystery. It's kind of a slow-moving book. And so there was a desire to kind of speed up things and also save costs. And so all of the revised versions are several pages shorter than the original, so there are some significant differences. Some of the rewrites are minor, and some of them are major. Some of the revised versions have a completely different plot, where the new writer just came in and rewrote the whole thing. In this case, they changed the name of the clients and a few other things, and they altered a few of the plot lines, but it's still essentially the same story. Now what happened is, in 1991, Applewood Books got permission from Grosset and Dunlap, the publishers of Nancy Drew, to republish facsimile versions of the first 6 Nancy Drew books, the ones done in 1930 and 1931. And so this is the only way you can get the original version, is with the Applewood Books versions. The Grosset and Dunlap versions are the revised versions from the 50s and 60s. But they were able to publish the first 6 Nancy Drew books in their original versions. They do have an introduction. This one has an introduction by mystery writer Sarah Pretsky. They have the original illustrations and so forth, and even the original ads in the back for other books. So it's just a duplicate of the original book. So if you want to get the original books, you have to get the Applewood versions. The standard ones you see in bookstores are the versions that were rewritten in the 50s and 60s. So hope that made it clear. Now, one last thing before we get to this book. This is not always going to be the case. I'm recording this in February of 2024. In 2026, the first 3 Nancy Drew books are going to fall into the public domain, which means they will no longer be copyrighted. And so anybody can publish them. And they'll also, I'm sure, pop up on Project Gutenberg as ebooks. So in a few years, you'll be able to get the first 3. In 2 years from now, from this time, you'll be able to get the first 3 Nancy Drew original books. And then the next 3 will be available in 2027 and so on. So in the coming years, these early editions of the Nancy Drew books are going to fall into the public domain. But right now, as I'm recording this, the Applewood book editions are the only ones that you can get of the original versions. There is a disclaimer at the beginning of this book about the racially stereotyped character. There's a character in here, which we'll talk about in a minute, named Jeff Tucker, who's portrayed the way a lot of blacks were in 1920s fiction by white authors. He speaks like Stephen Fetchit. He's an alcoholic. He's got 7 kids, and he's not very smart. And he's not treated very well by the other characters. So it does warn people about that, and it is a very problematic character. So I wouldn't recommend this original version for kids. I think this is more intended for adults who are nostalgic about Nancy Drew. Okay, so let's get to the plot very quickly. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but again, Nancy Drew is living in River Heights, and her big rival, her big enemy are the Topham sisters. The Tophams are this semi-well-to-do family who are stuck up, and everybody hates them, but they've got money, so you have to be nice to them, and they think they're God's gift to the world. And the 2 sisters, the Topham sisters, are mortal enemies of Nancy Drew. They had a falling out earlier on, and they don't like each other. Well, for years, they took care of an elderly guy named Josiah Crowley, who was rich. And they took care of him because they wanted his money. And he wrote a will out in which he gave his entire estate to them. But Nancy finds out, there are rumors going around that before his death, Crowley changed his mind and wrote another will in which he cut the Tophams out of the will entirely and gave his money to other relatives. And so she decides to try to find out if there's another will or not. While she's driving in her roadster, she gets hit by a rainstorm, and she drives her car into a barn out in the country, and by coincidence, it turns out that it's a barn owned by 2 sisters, the Turner sisters, who are relatives of Crowley, and they're living in a dilapidated farm, making their living off selling eggs and doing dress work and just barely making it. And they tell Nancy that Crowley told them that he was making out another will and leaving them some money. And so she becomes determined to find the will, but nobody knows where it is. And through a long, convoluted thing, it turns out that the clue to where the will is hidden in a clock. And it turns out the clock uh, belongs to the Tophams. He gave it to the Tophams, but the Tophams put this clock in a summer cottage on a lake a few miles away. And so Nancy takes up an invitation to go to summer camp with the intention of sneaking into that house and getting the clock. And she does that. She gets to the house, but it turns out that she stumbled onto a burglary. There's a bunch of stereotypical burglars who are unloading everything into a van. And she hides in a closet, but she gets caught, and they lock her in the closet and take off. And then she manages to get out with the help of this black caretaker, Jeff Tucker, who I said is they get him drunk and they slip him some kind of sleeping potion, and he's out while they're stealing. And he comes back and he lets Nancy out, and they go get the police. And Tucker wants to go with them to show them, to identify the cops, identify the bad guys, but the cops don't want a black guy in their car, and so they leave him behind. So another racially stereotyped scene from the 1930s. Eventually, Nancy is able to find them. The bad guys stop at a speakeasy and start drinking. Again, this is 1930s, still during Prohibition. And this is another scene that was eliminated in the revised version. The bad guys are in there getting drunk, and she sneaks in and manages to steal the clock. And so, again, she's stealing stolen property. It's already been stolen, but now she's stealing it and hides it from the cops. When the cops finally come and catch everybody, she doesn't give the clock over, so she's committing a crime too, which is, again, kind of problematic for a kid's book. She gets home, opens up the clock, and finds there's a notebook in there that tells where the will is, and so eventually the will is found, and everything ends happily except for the Tophams, who wind up losing their big house and having to move into a smaller house. And instead of being sympathetic about it, Nancy is gloating the whole time that the Tophams are, losing their money. The father has put too much money in the stock market. Of course, it's 1930 when the stock market was collapsing, and so she's gloating over the fact that they're losing everything. And so, again, not an entirely admirable character in these original versions. So, as I said before, the Nancy Drew books, these early ones, probably more for adults than for kids because of some of the problematic characters. A lot of problematic things were eliminated, but they also took out, in the revised versions, they also made Nancy a lot blander. She's a lot less interesting character than she is in these early books. Of course, the introduction here by Sarah Petretsky talks about the influence that Petretsky is a mystery writer, the influence that the Nancy Drew books had on her and helped persuade her to become a writer. And a lot of female writers have pointed back to the Nancy Drew books. And even Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor said that her inspiration for wanting to become a lawyer was from reading the Nancy Drew books. It gave her an idea that women could do things like be lawyers and solve crimes and fight for justice and so forth. So these books are very influential on generations of young women. The book is The Secret of the Old Clock, the original version by Carolyn Keene, a.k.a. Mildred Bunsen, published by Applewood Books. So that's it. It's been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching. See you next time.